Welcome back to Miles Reads. I'm Miles. Today, we're breaking down the classic work of social psychology, The Social Animal. How much of our behavior is truly shaped by the people around us? This book offers some revolutionary ideas that will change the way you see yourself and the world. Have you ever been driving along, minding your own business, when another car suddenly swerves and cuts you off? It forces you to slam on the brakes, leaving your heart pounding. In that moment, most of us have the same gut reaction. What is wrong with that person? We instinctively label them as reckless, inconsiderate, or just a bad person. But is that the whole story? Could there be another explanation? What if that driver is usually a model citizen, but this one time, they were rushing a critically ill passenger to the hospital? It's possible, or maybe it's not. The point is, as observers, we have a natural tendency to explain people's actions based on their internal factors, their personality, character, or motives. In reality, however, the most powerful force at play is often not these internal factors, but the social situation. The social situation is the external environment we find ourselves in, shaped by the presence and influence of others. Social psychology, the subject of this book, is the study of how these situations shape human behavior. And here's the book's core, game-changing idea. More often than not, it's the social situations we overlook that are the true root causes of our actions. The author, Elliot Aronson, is a titan in his field. In the century-long history of the American Psychological Association, he is the only person to have received its 3 highest awards for distinguished research, teaching, and writing. In his autobiography, he shared a charming story about his start in the field. He wasn't a psychology major in college, but he started sitting in on a psych class to spend time with a girl he liked. The professor happened to be the legendary Abraham Maslow, founder of the hierarchy of needs theory. In Aronson's own words, "I let go of the girl's hand and started taking notes. In that moment, I lost the girl, but I found my heaven." From that point on, Aronson dedicated his life to psychology, eventually becoming one of the most important figures in social psychology. The Social Animal is Aronson's masterpiece, widely hailed as the Bible of social psychology. Compared to other excellent textbooks like those by David Myers or even Aronson's own academic texts, this book stands out. Instead of just listing facts, Aronson weaves together a vast collection of real-world case studies to explore how psychology can be used to solve pressing issues like prejudice. You can feel the author's deep humanistic concern on every page. Reading this book, you won't just gain fascinating psychological knowledge, you'll experience the unique power of a discipline that bridges the natural and social sciences. In today's summary, I'll walk you through 4 key ideas from the book. First, humans are social animals. Second, our thinking is far more conservative than we realize. Third, our attitudes don't always cause our behavior, often they are created afterward to justify it. Fourth, if you want to build a relationship with someone, the best way might not be to do things for them, but to ask them to do you a favor. Let's start with the book's central argument. Humans are social animals. In his work Politics, Aristotle said, "Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human." Aronson quotes this to drive home his core point. What this means is that we are who we are precisely because we live in a society constantly influenced by others. An individual stripped of all social interaction is not a complete person in the truest sense. Though made over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle's observation was incredibly astute, and modern social psychology has repeatedly confirmed the immense power of the social situation on human behavior. In our daily lives, however, we tend to ignore the situation and attribute people's behavior to their inner character or disposition. In psychology, this is called the fundamental attribution error. Think back to the driver who cut you off. We see an annoying action and immediately conclude the person is bad. But social psychology teaches us it's rarely that simple. So, how exactly do situations influence our minds? A series of classic experiments provides the answer. The most famous of these is the Stanford Prison Experiment. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo randomly assigned a group of college students to play the roles of prisoners and guards in a simulated prison. The experiment was planned to last 2 weeks but had to be shut down after just 6 days. The reason? The students became completely consumed by their roles. The guards began to sadistically abuse the prisoners, while the prisoners became passive and desperate to please. These were all well-adjusted, high-achieving Stanford students. If you knew them personally, you would never imagine them capable of such acts. This shows us that when people feel they have power, they can behave in unthinkable ways, a clear demonstration of the situation's ability to shape behavior. Another proof of situational influence is conformity. You might think of yourself as an independent thinker, not easily swayed by others. But experiments by psychologist Solomon Asch found that in the right situation, most people will choose to conform. Imagine you're in a study where you have to judge the length of a line. You can clearly see the correct answer. But the 4 other people in the room, one after another, all state the same, obviously wrong answer. The task is simple, and you are 100% sure you're right. What do? In the actual experiment, the other 4 people were secretly working with the researcher. The results showed that 3/4 of the real participants chose to conform with the group's wrong answer at least once rather than state what they truly saw. If you asked them beforehand if they would conform, most would have said absolutely not. This experiment proves, once again, that the power of the situation is far greater than we think. Beyond conformity, we are also highly susceptible to the pressure of authority. In psychologist Stanley Milgram's experiment, participants were instructed to act as teachers and deliver electric shocks to a learner every time they answered a word pair question incorrectly. Most of us would like to think, I would never do that. But the results were stunning. When an authority figure in a lab coat urged them to continue, a staggering 65% of teachers kept administering shocks all the way to the highest level. Of course, no one was actually being shocked, it was an elaborate setup. But the results help explain real-world tragedies. For example, many Nazi officers during World War II were said to be decent people in their private lives, yet they committed monstrous crimes under the command of authority. There are countless other studies and examples just like these, and they all point to the same conclusion. The social situation has a far greater impact on our behavior than we can possibly imagine. The author sums this up as Aronson's first law. People who do crazy things are not necessarily crazy. To recap the first point, humans are social animals, and the power of the social situation is immense. Even well-adjusted, ordinary people can be led to do shocking things when placed in a specific context, such as when they are given power, pressured by a group, or ordered by an authority figure. Next, let's explore the second fascinating idea. Due to cognitive biases, our thinking is far more conservative than we realize. You might consider yourself to be an open-minded person who analyzes problems and makes decisions rationally. However, a large body of psychological research shows that most of us aren't nearly as rational as we think. Psychologists have concluded that humans are cognitive misers. Because our brains have limited processing power, we don't rationally analyze every piece of information to make the best possible judgment. Instead, we rely on mental shortcuts like intuition and stereotypes to make a decision that is merely good enough. The result is that our thinking is more conservative than we imagine, biased toward protecting our existing knowledge, beliefs, and prejudices. The most classic example of this is confirmation bias. This is our tendency to actively seek out evidence that supports a belief we already hold, while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts it. In one experiment, college students were asked to prepare questions to interview a person they were told was either an extrovert or an introvert. The results showed that if participants believed the person was an extrovert, they would ask leading questions like, "What do you do to liven up a party?" If they believed the person was an introvert, they asked questions like, "What's the one thing you dislike most about noisy parties?" Their preconceived notions led them to seek out confirming information. In real life, confirmation bias makes us intellectually conservative and resistant to changing our minds. Another example of cognitive bias is the hindsight bias, also known as the "I knew it all along" effect. After we know the outcome of an event, we tend to believe we could have predicted it. In one experiment, researchers described the background of a historical event to participants and gave them 4 possible outcomes, asking them to guess the real one. After being told the correct answer, which was actually chosen at random, a majority of participants claimed that this outcome was consistent with their own predictions. Their judgment was purely an after-the-fact rationalization. In short, as cognitive misers, our brains tend to take the easy way out. This conservative mode of thinking leads to confirmation bias, hindsight bias, and many other cognitive fallacies that keep us locked into our existing beliefs. Now for our third point, attitudes don't always cause behavior often, they're just an after-the-fact explanation for it. We usually assume that our attitudes come first and our actions follow. For example, I like vanilla ice cream, so I choose to buy it. But it's not always that simple. In the 1930s, anti-Chinese sentiment was strong in the United States. In 1934, the sociologist Richard Lapierre called 128 hotels and restaurants and asked if they would serve Chinese customers. Over 90% said no. However, when Lapierre actually visited those same establishments with a young Chinese couple, they were refused service at only one of the 128 locations. This study revealed that the link between stated attitudes and actual behavior is far from straightforward. In some cases, the causal relationship is even reversed. Simply put, we often act first and then invent a logical explanation for our actions, which in turn forms or changes our attitude. We do this to justify our own behavior. In psychology, this phenomenon is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a state of tension that arises when a person holds two psychologically inconsistent cognitions, such as conflicting ideas, beliefs, or attitudes. To resolve this unpleasant feeling, we unconsciously change one of the cognitions. Take smoking, for instance. A smoker reads a medical report stating, "Smoking causes cancer." At that moment, the cognitions "I smoke" and "smoking causes cancer" are in conflict. The best solution would be to quit smoking, but that's extremely difficult. If the smoker can't change their behavior, they might change their attitude instead, perhaps by seeking out anecdotal evidence of lifelong smokers who live to be 90 to reassure themselves. After the U.S. Surgeon General's landmark report on the dangers of smoking was released in 1964, a survey found that while 90% of non-smokers believed the report, a full 40% of heavy smokers said they did not believe it and came up with various reasons why. These smokers weren't smoking because they disbelieved the report, they disbelieved the report because they were already smokers. This principle is everywhere in our lives. Think about buying a car. Before the decision, you meticulously compare options. But as soon as you've made the purchase, you start paying close attention to positive reviews of your car and avoiding negative ones. This is because after any major decision, we almost always experience dissonance. To resolve it, we constantly persuade ourselves that we made the right choice. While cognitive dissonance reveals our irrational side, it can also be used for good. For example, psychologists used it to help overweight women with weight loss. They were recruited for a weight loss program that also involved an unrelated intellectual task. For one group, the task was very strenuous, for the other, it was easy. After 1 month, there was little difference in weight loss between the groups. But 6 months to a year later, the high-effort group had lost an average of 8 pounds, while the easy-effort group had lost none. The high-effort group was more successful because of cognitive dissonance. They had invested significant effort, and to justify that investment, they had to strengthen their belief. I put in so much work, so I must really want to lose weight. This reinforced attitude helped them stick with their goal. So that's our third point. Attitude is often the result of behavior, not the cause. This is due to cognitive dissonance, where we adjust our beliefs to justify our actions and reduce internal conflict. By understanding this principle, we can even use it to achieve difficult goals like losing weight. Finally, let's look at our fourth idea. If you want to build a relationship with someone, the best way might not be to do things for them, but to ask them to do you a favor. In life, when we want to get closer to someone, our first instinct is often to do nice things for them, hoping to win them over. But psychological research shows this approach doesn't always work and can even backfire. The other person might become suspicious of our motives, wondering what we want in return, and put their guard up. A much smarter approach is to ask them to do you a small favor. This is far more likely to bring you closer. The principle behind this is the same one we just discussed: cognitive dissonance. After the person helps you, they need to find a good reason for their action. They'll rationalize it to themselves. Why did I help him? Well, it must be because he's a great person who deserves my help. They convince themselves of this, and as a result, they will like you more. This technique has a long history, with a classic example coming from one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. He once had a political rival who consistently opposed him. To win him over, Franklin devised a plan. Hearing that his rival owned a very rare and curious book, Franklin wrote him a letter asking if he could borrow it for a few days. The man sent it over immediately. A week later, Franklin returned the book with a thank you note. The next time they met, the rival approached Franklin and spoke to him something he had never done before. They eventually developed a friendship that lasted a lifetime. Modern science has confirmed this effect. In one study, participants completed a task and received a cash reward. Afterward, the researcher approached some of the participants, explaining that the research funds were running low and asking if they would be willing to return a portion of their reward as a personal favor. The results showed that the participants who returned the money later rated the researcher much more favorably than those who did not. These stories teach us that we don't need to use brute force to build relationships. By applying principles of social psychology, we can often achieve a great result with very little effort. Alright, that's our look at 4 of the core ideas from the social animal. Let us do a quick recap. First, humans are social animals, and the power of the situation is far greater than we imagine. Second, our thinking is more conservative than we believe, filled with cognitive biases that favor the status quo. Third, our attitudes are often post hoc justifications for our behavior, not the other way around. Fourth, to win someone's affection, asking them for a favor may be more effective than doing 100 favors for them. Through this summary, I hope you've gotten a sense of the power and fascination of social psychology. Unlike other branches of psychology that focus on individual internal traits, it reveals how the social situation, an often ignored factor, plays a decisive role in our lives. Learning social psychology can help us in 2 key ways. Internally, it helps us examine ourselves more rationally and avoid common mental traps. Externally, it allows us to understand others with more empathy, to judge less, and to navigate our social world with greater flexibility and wisdom. And with that, you've finished another book.